They tell me I should write it all down before I forget. My granddaughter says that. She sits beside me on the porch, watching the patrol ships cross the evening sky, and she says, "Grandma Yara, people need to hear this from you. Not from a history book. From you." So here I am, writing it down. My name is Yara Osei. I am 71 years old. I spent 43 of those years in the Earth Space Fleet, and I watched the most impossible thing happen that this galaxy has ever seen. I watched the species that voted to erase us from existence become the ones who would rather lose their own worlds than let anyone touch ours. I still do not fully understand it, but I was there for all of it, so I will tell you what I saw. I was 26 years old when the Vreth Collective issued the Edict of Silence. I remember the broadcast. I was a junior lieutenant aboard a supply frigate, the ESS Carthage, docked at Kepler Station. 80,000 people lived on that station. It was one of our busiest hubs, full of cargo workers and engineers and families, and a small school where children learned about the stars through a thick observation window. The edict was not dramatic. That is what people do not understand. There was no speech, no declaration of hate. The Vreth Collective was made up of 6 alien species, and together they were the largest governing body in this part of the galaxy. They were old, organized, and very calm. The edict read more like a maintenance order than a sentence. It said, in plain language, that humanity represented an unpredictable variable in galactic development. It said our emotional decision-making, our inconsistent behavior, and our rapid expansion made us incompatible with long-term stability. It said the most efficient solution was removal. Removal. That was the word they used. 3 hours after the broadcast, Kepler Station was gone. I was already in an escape pod, by luck more than skill. I floated in the dark and watched through the small round window as 80,000 lives simply stopped existing. No fire, no sound, just the station, and then empty space where the station had been. I did not cry. I was too shocked to cry. I just watched the empty space and thought, in a very quiet and stupid way, that someone needed to do something about this. That thought never really left me. What happened next is the part that history books get right, but they still somehow get wrong. Humanity fought back. Now, when people say that, they imagine great fleets and brilliant strategies and a species rising up with discipline and fury. And yes, some of that happened. But the real story is messier and stranger and, honestly, much more human than that. We fought back in ways that made no logical sense. We held colony worlds that had no military value because people refused to leave their homes. We sent small ships against enormous Vreth formations, not because we thought we could win, but because someone had to. We broadcast radio signals into empty space, not to reach anyone, just so that our voices existed somewhere outside of ourselves. Just so that if they did destroy us, something of us would still be traveling outward into the universe, forever. I joined a combat unit after the fall of Kepler. I was not a natural soldier. I was a supply officer who had never fired a weapon in actual combat, but the fleet needed people, and I was a person, so I went. The Vreth were precise and efficient and completely bewildering to fight. They did not waste movement. They did not take unnecessary risks. Every action they took had a clear purpose. When they surrounded a position and offered surrender terms, they fully expected the surrounded party to calculate the odds and comply. We almost never complied. And this drove them completely out of their minds, not with anger, the way a human enemy might get frustrated, but with something closer to confusion that slowly deepened into something like dread. There was a woman named Consul Mind Avith. She was from one of the Vreth species, the Yashan, tall and gray and thin, with eyes that were a little too large and a way of tilting her head when she was thinking that I would come to find, years later, almost familiar. Avith was the collective's senior analyst. When the war did not end quickly, as they had planned, the collective sent her to study us, to understand why we kept going when every model said we should stop. I did not know about her for a long time. I only found out about her reports years after the ceasefire, when they became public record. But I have read every one of them since, and I have to say, reading Avith's reports is one of the strangest experiences of my life, because she is watching humanity from the outside, with no emotional investment, trying to describe us the way you would describe a weather pattern or a chemical reaction. And what she writes is both completely clinical and somehow more honest about us than most things written by humans. Her first reports are confident. She has a model. She expects us to behave like any other species facing extinction pressure, to consolidate, to protect the most valuable population centers, to negotiate, and eventually, to yield. Her later reports start to sound worried. The incident that changed everything for her was a place called Duras 4. I was not there personally, but I knew soldiers who were. A human garrison was completely surrounded on Duras 4. 3,000 soldiers and about 12,000 civilians sheltering in underground facilities. The Vreth fleet above them was overwhelming. Aveth was aboard the command vessel, observing. The Vreth commander transmitted formal surrender terms. They were not even cruel terms. The soldiers would be held in secure facilities. The civilians would be relocated. The edict required removal of humanity, but it did not require suffering. The collective was, in its strange way, trying to be efficient about it. The garrison commander's response was to request 48 hours to consider the terms. The Vreth granted this, expecting the humans to use the time to prepare an orderly surrender. Instead, the humans used the time to dig deeper fortifications, redistribute their remaining supplies, and, according to every account I have ever heard, to sing. They organized a kind of informal concert. Different soldiers knew different songs. They taught each other. They sang old Earth songs and colony songs and songs that individual people had made up on the spot. They recorded all of it and transmitted it on open frequencies, not to anyone in particular, just out into space. Aveth intercepted these transmissions. She listened to them. She wrote in her report, "I cannot determine the strategic purpose of this activity. The humans are aware that their position is not survivable. They appear to be preserving cultural data, as if they believe someone will one day receive it and wish to know what they sounded like. I find this very difficult to model." The garrison held out for 9 more days before a relief force broke through the Vreth lines. After Duras 4, Aveth's reports stopped trying to model us. They started trying to understand us. That is a very different thing. The moment I always come back to, the moment I think of as the actual turning point, was the Battle of the Hollow Run. I was there for that one. The Hollow Run was a long jump corridor between 2 of our core systems. If the Vreth took it, they could move freely between 2 fronts and cut our supply lines in half. We had 1 ship we could spare to hold it, the ESS Unbroken, a destroyer that had already been through 3 major engagements and was held together, honestly, with improvised repairs and the strong opinions of its chief engineer. I was assigned to the Unbroken 3 days before the Vreth pushed into the corridor. The captain was a woman named Sarah Mwangi. She was calm in a way that was almost frightening, not cold, just settled, like she had already made peace with whatever was coming, and now she was just focused on the work. The Vreth sent their first squadron through on the morning of the 4th day. We were supposed to hold for 48 hours. That was the plan. Relief forces would arrive in 48 hours if we transmitted the signal. We held for 11 days. I will not pretend those 11 days were heroic in the clean way stories make things sound. They were exhausting and frightening, and there were hours where I was certain we were finished. The ship took damage every day. We lost people. We made repairs that any engineer would look at in peacetime and call completely impossible. We drained fuel reserves and then sent a small crew in a shuttle to skim fuel from a gas giant at the edge of the system, a procedure that had about a 40% chance of destroying the shuttle. The shuttle came back. Captain Mwangi sent a log entry home every single day. Not a tactical report. A log entry. Personal, detailed, specific. She wrote about the crew by name. She wrote about what people were eating, what they were worried about, what jokes were going around the ship. She wrote one entry that was entirely about the fact that Ensign Darko had somehow kept a small plant alive in his bunk for 4 months, and everyone on the ship had become very emotionally invested in whether it survived. She sent these logs knowing there was a good chance no one would receive them in time to matter. On the 11th day, the relief force came. Our whole reserve fleet, redirected on the word of one admiral back home who had received Mwangi's daily logs and made a decision that was not strictly supported by the tactical situation. He later said, "She said she would hold, so I sent everything we had. Because when Sarah Mwangi says she will hold, she holds." The Vreth fleet withdrew from the Hollow Run. Aveth, who had been observing the engagement from a collective monitoring post, filed a report that day that ended her career in the collective's intelligence service, not because she was wrong, because the collective was not ready to hear what she had to say. She wrote, "We cannot complete the edict, not because we lack the power to destroy their remaining forces. We likely still have that power. We cannot complete the edict because the cost of completion is not military. It is narrative. If we destroy humanity, we will not have solved a problem. We will have created a story, and that story, of the small bright species that sang while surrounded and held corridors alone for 11 days and sent log entries home about a plant in a bunk, that story will travel further and last longer than any damage they have done to us. Other species will hear it, and they will look at us differently forever. I recommend we find another way." The collective relieved her of her post and told her she was being emotional. She was not being emotional. She was being correct. But that took them a little longer to realize. The strike on the collective's home system happened 6 months later. I was not part of that mission. I want to be clear about that. It was a desperate gamble approved by commanders who were running out of options. 12 ships. A target they could not hold and knew it. The purpose was not conquest. The purpose was the message. They caused significant damage. Then they retreated cleanly. And they broadcast on every frequency available. We are not here to destroy you. We are here to remind you that we are still here. We will always still be here. Something about that message broke the collective's confidence in a way that nothing else had managed. Not the military losses, not the failed projections. That single sentence, spoken by a species that should have been gone already, that had every reason to be gone already, and was still here, still transmitting, still insisting on its own existence. The political arguments inside the collective that followed lasted 8 months. I am told some of them were extremely loud, which was apparently unusual for the Ishan, who prided themselves on calm. Avith was brought back in, given emergency authorization, told to open contact with human command. She reached out to me. I was a commander by then. I had a reputation, apparently, for being direct. Avith sent a private channel communication that simply said, "Commander Osei, I would like to speak with you. I want to know what your people actually want." I almost did not respond. My communications officer had to convince me. "Admiral, it might be real." I told him that if it was a trick, we would deal with that. If it was not a trick, we could not afford to ignore it. So I answered. That first conversation with Avith was the strangest hour of my life. She asked me questions that no enemy had ever asked before. She did not ask about our military capabilities or our political structure or our supply lines. She asked what we wanted. She asked what we were protecting. She asked, very quietly, why we kept fighting when we knew we might lose. I told her the truth. I said we were not fighting to win. We were fighting to exist. I said that every species in the galaxy deserved to exist, to make choices and sing songs and keep plants alive in their bunks, and make all the mistakes that came with being alive. I said we never wanted war. We never threatened the collective. We only ever wanted to be left alone to be ourselves, loudly and imperfectly, the way we had always been. There was a long pause on the channel. Then Avith said, "I think I understand. I am not certain my colleagues will understand, but I will try to explain it to them." The ceasefire came 3 weeks later. Not a peace treaty. Not yet. Just a stop. Just quiet. We used the quiet to bury our dead. The years after the ceasefire were hard. We were broken in a lot of ways. Colonies reduced to rubble. Populations scattered. Resources stretched to their limit. The collective watched and, I think, genuinely expected us to crumble. Expected that we would do what exhausted civilizations do, and shrink inward, and slowly fade. We rebuilt instead. I know that word sounds simple. It was not simple. It was tens of millions of people, many of whom had lost almost everything, choosing to get up every morning and put one more thing back in place. It was arguments about where to plant crops in soil that was not great, and choices about which buildings to reconstruct first, and decisions made on the ground by ordinary people who had not been given any orders. They just looked at the problem and started solving it. Avith came to see it herself. She requested permission to observe a reconstruction crew on one of our bombed colony worlds. Her people approved it, I think, because they expected her to come back and report that we were, after all, dying slowly, that the rebuilding was theater, that eventually the numbers would win. She stayed for 6 months. She came back and filed one final report. I have read this report many times. I have parts of it memorized. It ends like this. I have spent 6 months among humans during their most difficult period of recovery. I observed them mourn in the morning and celebrate a birth by afternoon. I watched them argue intensely about the best way to grow food in poor soil, as if the outcome of that argument was the most important thing in the universe. For them, in that moment it was. I have encountered many species in my career. I have never encountered a species that treats survival as insufficient. Humans do not merely survive. They insist on living. I do not have a word in my language for what they are. I am not certain any language does. My recommendation is simple. Leave them alone. Do not interfere with them again. Not because they are dangerous, though they are, but because they are something the galaxy has not seen before, and that thing should be allowed to continue. The collective accepted this recommendation. The formal peace came 2 years later. I did not expect what came after. The Sheth were one of the 6 species in the Vreth collective. They were large, insectoid, built for physical strength, and they had a deeply held cultural value around the idea of worthy struggle. They had followed the collective's edict because the collective was their governing body and they followed orders. But they had watched the war with complicated feelings. A Sheth commander named Vareth Six contacted the fleet 7 years after the ceasefire. His message was formal and awkward and translated a little strangely, but the meaning was clear. He said his people wanted to learn from us. He said they did not understand how we had chosen to keep going when the math clearly said to stop. He said in their culture, fighting when you can win is expected. Fighting when you might lose is respected. But fighting when you know you will probably lose, simply because the fight is right, that was something they had no word for either, and they wanted to understand it. He asked if a Sheth unit could serve alongside a human patrol fleet. I was fleet admiral by then. I took the meeting personally. I walked into a briefing room with half my officers, people who had lost family and friends in the war, sitting across from a row of Sheth soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms, all of them very still, very watchful, clearly nervous in their own way. The tension was thick. I could feel it from across the room. I was trying to find the right words, something diplomatic and measured. And then Ensign Yemi Daro, 22 years old and very junior and completely unaware of the weight of the moment, knocked over a full thermos of coffee trying to reach across the table. Coffee went everywhere. Yemi went red. He looked up at the nearest Sheth soldier and started apologizing in a complete panic. The Sheth soldier looked at the spreading puddle of coffee for a long moment. Then he made a sound that his translator rendered as, "This also happened to me on my first morning of duty. Different liquid, same result." Yemi laughed. The Sheth soldier made the sound again, and just like that, something in the room shifted. I did not make a speech that day. I did not need to. I handed the Sheth soldier a new cup of coffee, which he received with enormous seriousness, as if it were a formal gift, and I said, "Welcome aboard." That was the beginning of the Vreth Guard. 20 years passed. The Vreth Guard grew from one joint unit to a full multi-species force deployed across the frontier of human space. Other species from the old collective joined over time. Avith's descendants served in it. Vareth Six's own daughter commanded a battalion. Then the Keth Dominion appeared. They were from deep space, further out than the old collective's reach, and they had never encountered humans. They had heard old records, fragments of the collective's original assessment, small emotional species, irrational, inefficient, low threat. They looked at the Eridan colonies on their expansion path and saw easy territory. They sent a fleet. I got the transmission from the Vreth Guard commander, a Sheth named Orev, daughter of Vareth Six, before I even got the tactical report from my own officers. She did not ask permission. She said, "Admiral Osei, they have moved against Eridan. We are already going. Please do not ask us to stop." I did not ask her to stop. The Keth fleet was turned back without a single human casualty. The Vreth Guard met them before they reached the first colony. The message sent to the Keth Dominion afterward was not from humanity. It was from the Guard. It said, "In every language the Dominion spoke, these worlds are not yours. We know what happens to those who reach for them. We were the last ones to try. Look at what we became. Consider carefully before you repeat our mistake." The Dominion withdrew. We have not heard from them since. My granddaughter is asleep now. The sky is dark and the patrol ships have moved on past the horizon. I think about Avith sometimes. She passed away 12 years ago, peacefully, surrounded by her family. I attended the memorial. I was the only human there, and I did not understand any of the words spoken, but I understood the shape of it, the gathered faces, the quiet. The way grief looks the same in every species if you watch closely enough. I think about Captain Sarah Mwangi, who held the Hollow Run for 11 days and sent log entries home about a plant in a bunk. She is retired now, living on a farm on New Carthage. We talk occasionally. She is exactly the same as she always was, calm, settled, focused on the work in front of her. I think about Ensign Yemi Daro, who knocked over a thermos of coffee and accidentally started the healing of a war. People ask me how it happened. They want a strategy, a lesson, a clear reason. They want to know what humanity did right. I tell them the truth, which is that we did not do anything strategically right at all. We survived because we could not figure out how to stop. We earned respect because we refused to treat survival as the point. We made enemies into guardians because we kept being so completely and stubbornly and loudly ourselves that eventually something in them cracked open and they saw what we actually were. Not a threat, not a problem, not a variable to be removed, just people. Messy, grieving, singing, rebuilding, coffee spilling, plant keeping, log entry sending people who wanted nothing more than to be left alone to live. The Vreth swore to destroy humanity. Now they guard our worlds. I watch their ships cross the evening sky, and I think about all the roads that led here. All the small moments, all the choices made by ordinary people in terrible situations who simply refused to believe that this was how the story ended. And I think, yes, that is exactly us. That is exactly the most human thing that could have happened.